Hello friends, I'm Mohammad Tariq, Faculty Modern Indian History at Vajiram. We are going to discuss the question which was asked few days back of Modern Indian History in your optional paper 2, section A. Now a few things which you have to keep in your mind while attempting this very important questions. Number one, that most of the questions which they have asked are predictable as well as gettable. That if you do your homework in planned way, you can attempt almost all questions which were asked in this exam. The second thing which you have to keep in your mind, that the questions which they have asked is not factual. This is very analytical question. You have to know some basic facts, some data, some figures, some name, and that is true with all optional papers. But what they require is a bird's eye view of each topic, and the questions are designed to test your intellect more rather than your memory power. And that's good for all those students who have understood the subject, who have read quality books, who have attended good lectures. And we all believe here in Vajiram that there are no substitute of these two things: the quality lectures and the quality articles, quality books, or some quality study materials. That would help in framing your thought, and you would see how the thoughts are so important while understanding the question and attempting each question, because the language would be slightly tricky. The third thing you have to understand while understanding this paper is that when they write critically examine, as you can find in most of the question even in general studies, so what they do, they write half a sentence and the remaining half is almost hidden. And you have to extract from that statement what the original writer of this question and the person who had conceived this question, obviously they are university professors, very senior in that subject, what were in the minds of that teachers. And then the person who is going to evaluate your answer would be another person. Now you have to connect two minds, one who had made the question, one who is going to evaluate the answer script, and in between the two minds you exist. Now what you have to understand, that there should be a triangular coordination and combination without meeting each other. So if you misread a word, or if you did not understand a particular word, you would mess up the entire question. So you must improve your vocabulary also. Generally, they don't ask too difficult language in civil services, but I will show that how some of the words are important while you attempt this question. So the half statement which they did not say, you have to understand very carefully that what is the hidden one. So half written and half hidden. Now if you do not understand the another half of hidden one and you just focus what is written one, then you are going to miss a very important part of the question, and that is very common in this exam. Obviously those students who have attempted this question in our test series, those who have attended our lectures, those who have read some quality books, they would never miss that one. So let's begin with the first question which was asked. The question is related to Battle of Plassey. You know that Plassey and Buxar are always important. After the Battle of Plassey, the mercenary became kingmakers. Now mercenary means those soldiers who do not work for any nation, any king loyalty. They basically work for money. Now one of the problem of 18th century India was that most of the states, right from the Mughals, they started losing their best soldiers, and East India Company started recruiting those soldiers. With the result, the East India Company's army, which actually consisted of mercenaries, they became much stronger rather than our Indian rulers' army. Now, obviously, they had better understanding about local tactics. They had better understanding about local topography, and East India Company used their experiences for their cause. So what the point here you have to mention, that right from 1764, that is Battle of Plassey, to all Anglo-Series wars, you all know that is Anglo-Marathas, Anglo-Mysore, Anglo-Punjab and Anglo-Afghan. In all those Anglo-Series wars, the soldiers were mostly mercenaries, and they would decide who would be rulers in different parts of the country. That is what the essence of the question. Now, what is interesting, that when you go back a little bit early, like the Mughals in their heydays, or even the Marathas or the Rajputs, the core army in most of the time was taken from their core composition of the area or certain identity. But in 18th century, most of the soldiers, as they were mercenaries, so this is very unique, that how the mercenaries shaped the destiny of both the rulers of India or East India Company, as well as the destiny of very India. That is what the entire demand of the question. So you have to start about the idea of mercenaries, how it emerged, and why East India Company was their favorite. That is because East India Company paid them well and paid on time. Most Indian rulers could not pay well, or they could not even pay on time. And that's the reason East India Company was as good attraction for them like multinational companies after 1991 in India. And that is what the demand of the question. The next question: the values of utilitarianism prompted the company administration to attempt reform of Indian society. Now, first you have to understand that utilitarian ideas came in India in little late 18th and early 19th century, as you have to know a little bit about Jeremy Bentham and his theory. But here you do not have to write his entire theory. You just have to have a basic idea that utilitarianists believe that we have to do morally, it is our duty to bring some good values in Indian society. We have to bring some better reforms in society as well as in education in India, because that is what evangelists also believed, that what the free traders also believed. But when the question is critically examined, as right from the beginning, each question you have to see not what is written on board, but what is also not written. So there is one element undoubtedly that some of them wanted to remove the evils of Indian society, and that our own Indian reformers also wanted. But there was another interesting interest of the colonial masters in India. For instance, those who supported social reform, they wanted a society which is liberal. Those who wanted modern education, they wanted a loyal Indian. They wanted Indian who should accept British product, accept British culture. So there are two important points which you have to understand going together. One is their so-called attempt to reform the society and education, and of course we benefited, and you have to count those reforms which were done by people like William Bentinck, people like Macaulay, as they are those who are famous utilitarians of early 19th century. And you have to mention that anti-sati law, you have to mention that anti-thagi laws, you have to mention that female infanticide which were banned, all this in 1830s and 40s, and of course Widow Remarriage Act. All these were done undoubtedly for good of us. Now the education which they brought, you can bring it from 1835 Macaulay Minute, you can bring that from 1854, that is Wood's Dispatch. This is all within the company's ambit. But one aspect of this education was to bring modernity, to bring certain part of liberal Western ideas. And another one was to influence Indian culture with the Western values so that we Indians could consume their products and could inspire to be like the Westerners. At least a section of Indian educated class would become loyal, and which they became. There was another important point while writing this question you have to keep in your mind, that back home in England and in Europe, they had to justify their rule in India, that why they are ruling in India. And that is what called white's man burden, that they wanted to show that we are here to modernize India, to reform India. And of course they did, but in bits and pieces, not complete modernization of India in any walks of life. So you would find very limited social reform, which you can mention. You would find rural India was not touched by and large, you can mention. You would find that the core issue of Indian society, that is superstitious beliefs and practices, that is large number of people remain illiterate. When British left India in 1947, hardly 12-13% people in India were literate. And that is a reality which you have to bring in your answer, that how it was not the only reason for reforms. The original idea could be some people only were concerned and keen for reforms, but by and large the colonial rulers were not interested in bringing any kind of modernity in their colonies, whether in Asian colonies or in African colonies. Now that should be the broad framework while you write this answer. Now the next question is, in course of the 19th century, the agenda of social reform was gradually replaced by revivalism. Now you have to understand that some reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, like Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, like Henry Vivian Derizio, like Prarthana Samaj social reform leaders, they all based on modern values, on modern liberal ideas, liberty, equality, fraternity, scientific tempers, but they also did not forget their past. For instance, Raja Ram Mohan Roy also translated 5 Upanishads, Rig Veda in Bangla. Sir Syed Ahmad Khan looked towards Quran for interpreting some of the Quranic verses in the light of modern age, which is called Ijtihad. Derizio was little bit more radical and his contribution was much limited, but Prarthana Samaj played very important role in modernizing the education as well as related to women. But what happened over a period of time, that revivalism started taking more front seat rather than reformation. And what is that revivalism? People like Wahhabis among Muslims and those involved in Arya Samaj movement as well as their various offshoots, they started glorifying their ancient past if they were Arya Samajis, medieval Islamic past if they were Wahhabis. And they started looking that as the past, and in any society, past is always seen as a golden era. They wanted to revive those values, those culture, and they believe that their religion, their culture are under severe threat from Western culture. So what is interesting, that both were targeting Western culture, but both were also concerned about each other. A group of Muslims were concerned with the influence of Hindu culture in the Muslim society, and among some Hindu reformers were concerned about the influence of Islamic culture in their day-to-day life, in food, in dress, in various other customs, and they wanted to what is called purify. So that Puritan movement is still going on in subcontinent in particular, and in many parts of in West Asia as well as in African countries. So the idea behind this entire movement originally was maybe hijacked by another group, but that is still debatable in history whether they were responsible because they started first, or it started on its own, because don't forget, it was colonial rule, and lot of suspicion was also there among both Muslim reformers and Hindu reformers. They saw every act of company or the British Crown later on, every act of Christian missionaries, every act of some liberals with the lens of some suspicion. And that's why they started looking more and more backward, which is also called backward looking movement or revivalist movement. So that is the entire central idea of this question, which once you have read these two topics, because as I told earlier that the question is not just to describe the contribution of Raja Ram Mohan Rai or Dayanand or Wahhabis, etc. The question is very interesting, thoughtful, and they would always love if you write your own understanding of this topic and do not be afraid of writing your own thought on this one. That is what towards the end you can add along with what we have already discussed. The next question. The federal provision of Government of India founded, and this is what I said that you have to be careful about the wordings, on the rock of princely intransigence. Now, in this topic, what you have to understand that Government of India Act 1935 had many provisions, but one provision became a reason for this question, and that is All India Federation, which would consist both princely states as well as British India's provinces. And at that time, India had 11 provinces, 2 more were added, that was Odisha and Sindh by this act. Now, first you have to understand that it is partly correct as far as the statement is concerned, because the other part which is hidden is that there was something wrong in the very act itself, which I will tell towards the end. But let's accept first the statement. Now, in this statement, if you can see, the blame is on stubbornness of princely state, and that is because it failed. That is what the demand of the question, and it is true to some extent, because the princely states were never ready to join British India, and that was because British India, which was led by reformers, then our freedom fighters, they always wanted to merge the two India, British India and princely states. But princely states got some options here, and that is why the blame goes first to the British Parliament, which passed this act, that they got an option that they could join this federation or they may not. And that is why the blame is not only on princely state but on the very British Parliament or the very British Crown. Second, what they did in this act, that according to 1931 census, the total people living in princely state were hardly 24%, even less than that, 24% of entire India's population. But in Council of States, they got 40% seats, and in Legislative Assembly, that is the lower house, they got 33.5% seats. Now, obviously, this itself was problematic. Now, another important point you have to understand that despite all this claim that we are going to give Indians autonomy, this act would not empower the Indian Central Legislative Council or state provincial assemblies, what is called council at that time, would be sovereign. The sovereignty would vest still with the British Parliament. And that is what all the criticism which you have to write, which is not given on the board. So you have to take from the board that yes, these princely state created hurdles. They were not ready to join this one, and that is why they kept out, as the very provision was such that they could remain aloof from the very federation. And the second part you have to write that how in the very act there was some provision which was against the interest of people of India. One more example you can give it, that the representative in provinces would come through election, whereas representative in princely states would come through nomination. So all these were reason that why this is seen with certain degree of criticism by historians, and only princely states cannot be blamed for the failure. Yes, they were. The strength of Pakistan program was in its vagueness. It meant everything for everyone. Now, this statement is also partly true because till you can say 1945, this statement is true. When you start from Iqbal, the great poet, in 1930 at Allahabad session of Muslim League, and when he gave a very vague idea of a separate Muslim autonomous region, let me clarify, he didn't use the word Pakistan and did not even ask partition, but a vague idea that in the east, that is now Bangladesh, in the west and north, that is now Pakistan, where Muslims were in majority, it should have greater autonomy. And what was that greater autonomy? Iqbal did not clarify. Do not forget, Iqbal was a poet, and generally poets are not necessarily great politicians. So his idea itself was very vague as the very question. The second important point is that when in 1937 to 47, Pakistan movement started gaining little bit popularity among a section of Muslims, particularly Muslim middle class. So in 1940, first time they officially accepted partition resolution in its Lahore session. But the very word Pakistan was not mentioned. And that is why the very question that it was a very vague idea right from the beginning. So if you keep in your mind Lucknow Pact in 1916, 1928 Nehru Committee report, and 1928 Jinnah's demand, then you can understand the real struggle was share of power among Muslim groups as well as Indian National Congress as well as some other Hindu groups. Now, Muslim League claimed that they are 25% population of India, whereas Congress was saying it was just 20%. And why it is so, that is also very interesting, which I hope you would learn in our classes. Now, Punjab, Delhi, and Western UP Muslim League leaders were more active in this demand of partition rather than the Southern Indian Muslims or even the East Indian Muslims. And that is another problem with this idea of Pakistan, that it was not a demand of Muslims in India. It was basically demand of Punjab, of Delhi, of Western UP. Now, who are they? They were zamindars. They were big landlords. Some of them were nawabs. Some of them had very good connection with the erstwhile Mughal rulers or some other elite families. Now, they had tasted power as many of them started, connecting themselves with some medieval rulers. And when they saw that the power is shifting away from them, so they started hardening their stand. There's a very famous theory in modern India on partition, and that theory is called bargain theory. Now, this theory was given by Aisha Jalal in the very famous book Jinnah, the Soul Spokesperson. And the theory is that Muslim League was never serious about Pakistan. All they wanted, some major 5 demands, part of Jinnah's 14-point program of 1928. Of course, it is a debatable topic in history, but the fact is that till 1945, Pakistan very idea was not very clear. For middle class, it was basically a secured job. It was secured education system. For zamindars and big landlords, they wanted security of their land, property, social status, because they were very much afraid of Nehruvian socialism. Then religious people, they had their own idea of Pakistan, as they believed that Islam would be glorified, Islam would be better protected and promoted when they have a separate Islamic state. Similarly, the lower middle class and peasant and working class, they had their own interests, but they were not interested in Muslim League project. Most of them were either with Congress or some local parties or with the leftist parties. And that is what you have to be very careful, that it was not a demand of Muslims at all. Yes, it was a demand of a section of Muslims led by Muslim League, led by Muslim middle class, and Muslim middle class itself was not very much beyond 10% or 12%, but they had right to cast vote, as it was based on limited franchise. Religious people would always have more appeal, so even sometime people from lower middle class and peasant and workers could be attracted towards utopian idea of an Islamic state. And that is why when campaigns were launched after 1937, like Muslim Mass Contact Program by Jinnah, it was a huge success. And when Nehru attempted, it failed. And the result was in 1945-46 election, Muslim League swept all the seats which were reserved for Muslims. And that gave an illusion. Even the Congress leaders were under trap of that illusion that Muslims as a whole are with Muslim League, which is not correct, because only 12-13% Muslims actually who had a right to cast vote. Yes, a good number of madrasas and Maulvis and religious leaders were with Mr. Jinnah, but that should not be taken that it was a pan-Indian Muslims, that it was Muslims of all classes who supported. So it was deliberately kept vague, or you can say the leaders did not have even a perfect idea of a nation state. So that is why this question has to be dealt in this background. Now, see, this question is from economic history, and I always say in my class that economic history question would fetch you more marks than political and social history, because there would be always some debate, some dispute. But here, if your concept is clear, for instance, that commercialization of agriculture actually were caused by many factors. What are those factors? That of course you would learn in our classes. One such factor was Industrial Revolution in England. So the demand of raw material increased many-fold. That was the basic reason for increased commercialization, the demand like cotton, the demand like sugar cane, the demand like tea, the demand like coffee, the demand like jute, all these is directly connected with urbanization, industrialization in England, in Europe. Now, apart from that, what else were the reason? As per the question, it is the revenue policies. So, whether you write in the beginning this part or you write towards the end, that how revenue policies also contributed in commercialization of agriculture. The British collected land revenue in cash mostly. So what happened that since they preferred to collect in cash, so you have to sell the crop in the market, and that is how it is going to encourage commercialization. Second important reason, the tax rate was very high. The interest collected by the money lenders was also very high. The transfer of land was very common, whether in permanent settlement region, Riyatwari settlement, or Mahalwari settlement region. Now, all these forced the farmers to grow cash crops rather than food crop, because they feared that they may consume themselves those food, because most of the farmers had very small piece of land, or even the middle level farmers, they feared that they may consume, so they started growing cash crops so that they can pay the tax, which was very high, and they protect their land, which was very frequently transferred. But there was also one other reason, allurement. A good number of peasants were actually allured because cash crops generally gives better profit. So the farmers of, if you see, Western India, that is what is today Maharashtra, were growing cotton. The farmers of Eastern India, what is today Bangladesh, were growing jute. The farmers of Northwest province, which is called UP also, what is today we call Western UP, were growing sugar cane. And obviously these peasants earn profit. That was also a reason why commercialization of agriculture increased or it got a pace. So it is not only the revenue policy. So that is what I keep telling, that certain part of the question would be very open, certain part would be hidden, but that is not impossible if you have attended class very carefully, if you have understood the concept, if you have read one or two standard textbook. That is what the demand of this question. Why was the Great Revolt of 1857 confined only to North India? How did it change the character of British rule in the subcontinent? Now 10 plus 10, 2 parts. So you have to give equal respect to both the part. First reason why it was confined to Northern India, because the soldiers came mostly from UP. And as you know, they came from Awadh region largely, even in Bengal army. And the soldiers of Meerut who revolted, they were mostly from Jat belt, Muslim Jat or Hindu Jat. Now, the seat of Mughal was in North India. Awadh Nawab, that is Wajid Ali Shah, whose kingdom was captured by the British after 1856. So what happened? The soldiers of UP were loyal towards Raja Nawab as well as the Begum, and they joined in large number. You have large number of victims of doctrine of lapse in this region, and those states which lost their kingdom like Jhansi, like Satara, like parts of central India, Kunwar Singh was also zamindar from northern India. Then Wahhabis were also very much active, and their headquarters Delhi, Faizabad, Patna, all North India. That's the reason why 1857 was confined mostly North India. Another reason was that the soldiers of southern India and western India were also supposed to join, but the original date was fixed 30th May, but the soldiers of merit had already started on 10th May. So companies, intelligence department and their other army unit became alert, and they did not allow the other 50% army to join. So that is the answer of the first part. Now, what is the answer of the second part? How it changed the character of British rule in the entire subcontinent, what is today Pakistan, Bangladesh, and even parts of Bhutan, Sri Lanka, etc. The first thing you have to write in this is the very much act which was passed in 1858. Then you have to write the Queen's Proclamation of 1858 and how the power was transferred from company to British crown. That is the first part. Second important point, how the entire army was restructured. For instance, the ratio of army between Indian and European was corrected from 1:4 to 1:2 in certain parts like Bengal and 1:3 in certain other parts of India. Then the key important points in the army and the positions were reserved for the Europeans or the British. Then they preferred certain martial race, what they call parts of Punjab as well as northwest as well as northern India, parts of Nepal and Gurkhas, and they gave more preference to that army. These are some of the changes in the character. Then they brought certain legislative changes since 1861 Indian Council Act, 1892 Indian Council Act, and started including Indians through first nomination, later on through election. That is another change in the character. Then they brought some changes in civil services. They brought changes in their attitude towards Muslims in the beginning. They were very hostile because they blamed Muslims for the revolt of 1857, and they got some collaborators from upper caste Hindus. Later on, when INC was formed in 1885 and nationalism started growing, and particularly Swadeshi movement, so they started changing their tactics and they started appeasing or supporting a section of Muslims, and with the result Muslim League was formed in 1906, and now they became anti-Congress, which was mostly led by upper caste. So this is what some of the change you can write in the character of British. Another important change you can say that earlier there was more ad hocism, now there is more regularities in different parts or organ of the government, whether it is legislative, executive or judiciary, and that is what the demand of this question. So there are two parts and you cannot do injustice to any one part. Now this question is also very analytical, debatable. Why did the demand of land reform never become an agenda of national politics after 1947? Elucidate. First of all, you have to be careful. Sometimes this type of a statement is given so that you immediately agree. So when you read this type of question, stop and think whether this statement is completely correct or it is partly correct. So I would say it was partly correct, not completely correct, because we know that in Constituent Assembly, we know that Nehru's government after independence, and we know that a lot of Congress leaders who were basically socialist, they were always talking about land reform, and they knew that majority Indians are farmers who do not own land or who are tenant farmer. without reforming land, you cannot expect to end or reduce equality. You cannot solve the problem of poverty. You cannot solve the problem of unemployment. And all your other reforms in education, in health, in other development are linked with land reform, because do not forget, India was not never an industrialized country except in some pockets. So we have to begin from agriculture and correcting the course from agriculture itself, and that was in the mind of planners. The very first 5-year plan, if you know, was related to agriculture. It was also a promise made by Mahatma Gandhi and other top Congress leaders before very independence, and that was land reform. So that is why you do not have to necessarily agree with the statement, but this could be just 20 to 25% of your answer. The remaining 70%, 75% of answers should be in the agreement of this statement, because it is true very much. How it was true? It was true because our parliamentarians to our panchayat leaders, so right from top parliamentarian to patwaris, actually they conspired to make sure that land reform project fails. Reason that most of the people who entered into politics, with few exceptions, they came from landlord class. Most of this landlord class came from upper and middle caste. Now the judiciary, the police, civil administration, top media people, and of course top political leaders, most of them came from this category. So we find a contrast and a contradiction, that on the one hand some of the top leaders were promising for land reform, on the other hand the very system which they evolved was captured by that landlord class. So in parliament as well as in the state assembly, it was discussed, and obviously the delays tactics as well as the dodging tactics became very common in the entire 1950s, 60s and 70s as far as various parts of land reform. But side by side you also would find that UP Zamindari Abolition Act 1949, then this Congress session in 1959, which happened in Nagaur, had taken a pledge that we will introduce sealing law, and the sealing laws were passed by different states very subsequently. So that is also a reality, that the answer is not complete, the question is not completely correct, that there were some serious attempts made by state governments, made by some political leaders, with these examples which I just gave that you can quote, but also the same system, the same judiciary, the same civil administration, the same media and the same political leaders did everything to puncture the very idea of land reform, with the result, by 1960s and 70s, on paper, most states declared that this number of land had been transferred from landlord or from rich farmers to the poor farmer, but on ground, in reality, it didn't change. Even sealing laws were very much misused. Of course, there are some exceptions. One such was West Bengal, one was Kerala, and one was Jammu and Kashmir, where the success of land reform is said to be much, much better than other states. And why so? That also you have to learn in our classes. Political extremism in colonial India often converged with cultural nationalism, but not always. Now, this question demands that how two very important points, one is culture and one is idea of India. It always converged in late 19th and early 20th century. When our socio-religious reform movement started gaining popularity among middle urban educated classes, from Bengal to Bombay to Madras presidencies especially, what happened in that period, people like Bankim Chatterjee, when gave this idea of India, people like Dayanand Saraswati, when they gave idea of Swaraj, so two things were converging. One is Hindu culture and one is Indian nationalism. And many of them visualized India with Hinduism. Now, what happened that even the map of India in those days were made in such a fashion that it looks like a goddess. And the very songs like Vande Mataram were regarded as a sign of cultural nationalism. Then Swadeshi movement. Now in Swadeshi movement, what happened? People like Aurobindo, Tilak, then you have Lala Lajpat Rai, they all used Ganesh festival or Shivaji festival or Bengali cultural identities, songs related to Durga, Kali, Bhavani. These were all parts of that cultural nationalism which is being talked. But here you have to be careful. When they were talking cultural nationalism, they did not mean to exclude someone. They just wanted to unite a large number of people, and since large number of people in most part of India were Hindus, so at that time they perhaps did not realize an inherent danger in using cultural nationalism as Indian nationalism. And this is very beautifully discussed in a book, Understanding Muslim Minds by Raj Mohan Gandhi. And he wrote about 8 top Muslims, leaders and intellectuals of late 19th till early 20th century, right from Sir Syed Ahmad Khan to Maulana Azad to Iqbal to Muhammad Ali Johar to Dr. Zakir Hussain to Fazlul Haq, now and Liaquat Ali Khan. Each of them had their own constituency, their own region as well as followings. Each of them wanted a united secular India, and of course Jinnah was one of them. But they had one complaint, and the complaint according to Raj Mohan Gandhi was that they saw Indian nationalism as a Hindu nationalism. Now the problem was that this doubt could never be clarified, that this cultural nationalism is actually not anti-Muslim, it's not anti-Sikh, it's not anti-Christian. But since majority people in India were Hindus, so it is quite obvious they would use Hindu idioms, Hindu festivals, Hindu languages, Hindu gods and goddesses. But in their subconscious mind, they did not have any ill wills against any religion, which many of them thought otherwise. And that confusion or that lack of clarity, you can say any of the two, is one of the reasons why that they had some doubt. But very interestingly, that later on, when our leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, like Jawaharlal Nehru, like Subhash Chandra Bose, like Bhagat Singh, when they led the movement in different ways, they either used all religion, as in case of Gandhi, Sarva Dharma Prarthana Sabha in Rowlatt Satyagraha case, Gandhi used Khilafat issue also in his movement. So now the Muslims could not complain that Hindu nationalism is only the dominant one. Now in case of Nehru, Subhash and Bhagat Singh, they did not even use religion. If you just check it, Subhash Chandra Bose slogan, Jai Hind. If you just check the slogan Bhagat Singh used was mostly Inqilab Zindabad. Though this Inqilab Zindabad was given by Hasrat Mohani, but it was used more by Bhagat Singh, which is a very secular slogan. So this question is dealing two parts. One is before World War I and Russian Revolution, and one is after World War I or Russian Revolution. So that is how the question is very interesting. It requires a holistic idea, and apart from your regular reading, some lectures, some magazines, some good books would also help in dealing this kind of complex question. Regionalism in India after 1947 was occasioned by development imperative as much as linguistic particularism. Now here you have to understand that language and regionalism are two important keywords. Now quite often it is same and quite often it is different. Now if you look at carefully in the 1950s, 60s, 70s and 80s, language became an important reason for conflict. The very creation of Andhra Pradesh and the formation of SRC in 1953 to 55 and then creation of 14 new states on language basis in 1956. That you have to write about a story of linguistic based issue in India. But how in entire Northeast, when the people revolted against greater Assamization, and how in central India also when parts of tribal belts revolted against this, and how within UP, which was a Hindi belt, within Maharashtra, which is a Marathi belt, we find that a voice emerged against not language but against sub-regionalism. So what happened that the development issue is not only linked with linguistic issues but also regional development, sub-regionalist development. And if you see the British map of India, you would find huge imbalance in terms of development, whether it is agriculture, whether it is industries. So what happened after independence, each region and sub-region who started aspiring to develop their region, sometime they used language for that development, sometime they used regional identity or within region, sub-regional. For instance, when in 1953 Tamils and Telugus fought, it was thought that language is the reason as it is very emotive, undoubtedly, and they got separated. But how would you explain 2014, that is division of Andhra itself from Andhra to Telangana? Both spoke Telugus, and that shows that here it is that regionalism which is more dominant factor than language. And that regionalism is purely developmental oriented. It has nothing to do with religion, nothing to do with language. And the same story is Pakistan also, that when Pakistan was created by Jinnah and company, it was thought that religion can unite all. But what happened to the Bengalis? They revolted against the Punjabi and Urdu Muslims and they created Pakistan East as Bangladesh with the help of India in 1971. So whether it is Sri Lanka, if you look at Sinhalese versus Tamil, so it is not only the language, it is the development. So region and language, region without language, development is the key issue of the conflict. As historically speaking, most part of the subcontinent are very unequal in terms of development, and that is the core of this entire issue. 20 years of peace secured by the Treaty of Salbai, which happened in 1782, proved very costly to the Marathas in strategic terms. We often see that how certain peace can be responsible for some future course of action. This is one such treaty. It brought peace for East India Company, which was also fighting at that time with Mysore, very crucial for the East India Company. And one reason why they had to sign this with the Marathas was their ongoing conflict with Mysore. So this treaty helped more East India Company rather than Marathas. It could have helped Marathas also had they used this time to strengthen their position and capitalize the opportunities which they did not. East India Company, on the other hand, used this time from 1782 to 1802. What they did, that they first consolidated themselves in Mysore through these three wars, that is Second Anglo, Third Anglo and Fourth Anglo-Mysore War. And finally, as you know, that in the fourth, Tipu Sultan was defeated and killed. So a very good part, what is today Karnataka, formerly Mysore, was under their control through a puppet regime that was Chikka Krishna Raja. Once they consolidated that part, now they could move towards the northern part of Karnataka, which is now Maharashtra. And here they easily defeated those Marathas between 1802 to 6. First, the Peshwa himself came in the lap of East India Company after their internal conflict and signed the famous as well as the humiliating treaty in 1802, that was in December. And once the Peshwa signed, then the other Marathas, that is the Holkars, the Scindias, the Gaikwads and the Bhosles, they started signing one after another. Holkars were the last one, but they could do it, East India Company could do it because East India Company had strengthened her position during this period. Another important point, in the same period, they strengthened their position through subsidiary alliance that was between 1798 to 1805 by Lord Wellesley. Now, during this period, company could make a lot of allies and company could station their army at important locations which were once owned by the Marathas. Now, that strategic location is a big loss of Marathas. So when in 1817 and 1818 the Third Anglo-Maratha War took place, Marathas were not in position to resist at all. They had already been weakened during Second Anglo-Maratha War and completely wiped out after 1817-18. How it is all connected with Treaty of Salbai, that is what the base of the question, and that was the time. Time in any field is very crucial. In the war and in diplomacy, time is always very crucial. So how you are using that time and strengthening your position. Company was visionary, led by visionary people. Marathas and Indian rulers actually did not have a vision or a futuristic plan, and that was one of the reasons why they could not utilize the given window which they had after this Treaty of Salbai. Swadeshi movement of 1905 anticipated many of the tactics that were later developed during Gandhian mass movement. Again, this is a trap. The trap is that the line of the question is that you have to agree, but you have to be careful. Mahatma Gandhi certainly used the tactics of strike, the tactics of boycott, the tactics of establishing Swadeshi institutions as well as Swadeshi product. Though, just as a matter of fact, you have to know that some of these strategies had already been adopted by Wahhabis in 19th century, much before even Swadeshi movement. Mahatma Gandhi's uniqueness in Indian history is that he learned from the past, but he also added his own value. First important thing, the idea of Satyagraha, that was not in Swadeshi movement. And what was that idea? To change the heart and mind of opponent, even if required through self-suffering like fasting. It was Gandhi who brought that element, not Swadeshi movement. And that is what you have to critique this question, that Gandhi brought a very important moral principle in that movement which was not there before Mahatma Gandhi. Second important point is that Gandhi connected this movement with socio-economic issues, that is anti-liquor movement, anti-untouchability movement, that is to make khadi as well as to make it as a sustainable thing rather than just out of some protest, and Hindu-Muslim unity. These are all very important constructive program which Gandhi would bring. So Gandhian movement would not be a movement which would be confined to few months, but it would be 24/7 because it is socio-economic changes he wanted. And political movement could be periodic, but socio-economic would be always. And that's the reason that a Gandhian once active in those constructive programs, for them it was very easy to join a Bardoli Satyagraha, or to join civil disobedience, or to join individual Satyagraha, or to join non-cooperation movement. All these were done because Gandhi connected political issues with socio-economic issues. That was not in Swadeshi movement. And obviously, some part, as I told, is correct. But this is very important to keep in your mind, that most of the statement which they give, half written and half hidden. So the half hidden which was not there, which I brought all these Satyagraha and Gandhian constructive program, that you can write only when you have a clarity of the subject like history, through some classes as well as some good reading. The trade union movement joined forces with the mainstream of nationalist politics to strengthen each other in their struggle against colonial rule. This question once again is half written, half hidden. There is no doubt that trade union movement from 1920s to 40s, in which the industrial workers and our Indian nationalists helped each other cause, which you have to write right from the beginning, like Lala Lajpat Rai, who was president of AITUC, founded in 1920. He was a nationalist leader. Then Congress leaders supported fully the workers' issues in different parts of India, in various industries. And the worker issues that hope you all understand, that is wages, that is job security, that is working and living conditions, and various holidays, etc. These were basically the class interest you call, workers issue you call. Similarly, national issues, that is Swaraj till 1928, Poon Swaraj, that is from 1929 onwards, and all other political issues which could be related to peasant or women or tribals or any other class. So that all would be put together, national issues. So workers did join for their own issues as well as issues of others. Congress did support, but there is again a catch here. There were occasions in which Congress leaders and Congress party were accused by the workers, by the supporters of workers, especially led by leftist groups like CPI, CPIM, etc. And what was their complaint? Their complaint was that when it comes to issues related to workers of Bombay and Ahmedabad, Gandhians and Congress attitude was more towards industrialists rather than workers. And here Gandhi would try, or Congress would try, to compromise. Reason? The industrialists were mostly Indians in textile mill work of Bombay and Ahmedabad. But when it came to Bengal, where the workers were mostly working in jute factory, and jute mill were owned by British. So here the workers got more support from the nationalists on most of the issues, and here we find that our nationalists went directly against industrialists because the industrialists were British or Europeans, and here they would try to compromise. Now this is something which is hidden, and that is what, unless you read some very good book, as I told, you cannot catch the very essence of this question. Another important point, whether it is nationalist or by and large other trade union organization, they ignored the tea planters who were living as bad life as these workers, and in many cases much worse in Assam and Darjeeling, etc. Those who were working in various mines, they were also very much in bad position. But we don't find much trade union movement either by the leftist or by the Congress. In some cases, the leftists started in parts of Jharkhand in the mines, but in tea plantation, mostly they lived in a very miserable condition, and that is what another critique of both nationalists and leftists. Now, one more area you have to be careful. When we talk about trade union movement, it is actually organized, registered, and since 1926 Act, since trade union movement was legalized, so the activities increased. But it was in organized sectors where they got some support. What about unorganized economic system where large number of workers were working in MSMEs, local shopkeepers, and their condition was very, very miserable. We do not find any such great efforts during freedom struggle period and even after independence. That is one of the criticism coming up in the recent studies, that is in the last 25 years of post-independent India. So that is what the idea of this entire question, to test whether you understand only one part or you understand the hidden part of the question also. India's developmental strategy after independence was influenced by economic imperative, not ideological consideration. Comment. Once again, you do not have to necessarily completely agree with this statement, and you can think in the very beginning it is partly true. Let's accept how it was partly true. The two great ideologies at that time, capitalism and socialism, in different form. We adopted mixed economy, and that is the classical example of this issue, that it was our desire to develop public sector's undertaking as well as private sector. One reality, that land in India was in private hand. One reality, that MSMEs were in private hand. One reality, that a lot of modern industries since late 19th century from British era itself, like in cotton textile case or some of the other chemical industries, Tata Industries, these were also in individuals' hand. So the companies like Birlas, like Bajaj, like Tatas, they were all private in the British time itself. So that was all a reality with our national leaders or architect of modern India. But they also knew to eradicate poverty, to check this unemployment rapidly, and to help infrastructure in road, rail, ports, etc. We need public sectors, because the gestation period here would be very long and the private players may not be very much interested. To develop agriculture, we needed power projects, we needed dams, and this all had to be done by the state. And that is why the idealism of capitalism and socialism debate, which had divided the world, had to be kept aside for the sake of economic development. So this is one argument. You can go at least half of your answer. But the remaining half is, which I keep telling, hidden part. And what is that? Yes, ideological consideration did play an important role. If you know the preamble, if you know the directive principle of state policy, and you know that socialism is one strong element, though the word socialism came later on, but the idea was already there in the minds of top leaders. That includes Jawaharlal Nehru, the very first Prime Minister, a hardcore socialist. He didn't want, as he said famously, a modern Maharajas. What he meant by modern Maharajas, modern capitalists. And that's why his heart always lied with public sectors. So you would find a lot of SAIL, BHEL, GAIL industries emerged in his period. Institutions like IITs, central universities emerged in his period to back up those industries and development. And this is purely ideological base. Most critical industries were also kept by the state. And do not forget, Nehru and many of his leaders, including some other socialists like Jayaprakash Narayan, Ram Manohar Lohia, they were always suspicious of this private sectors, foreign investment. And they saw these people always with contempt, that they're only profit motivated or oriented people, and they had a great love affair, I would say, with public sector, because they said they are service provider. And that's what the ideological roadblock many people say today was with early Indian leaders, which blocked the very investment as well as the opening of the market, which happened in 1990s onwards. But you have to understand that unlike European capitalists, Indian capitalists by and large came from a very narrow social background. And we had a tendency of maintaining our privileges. They would not necessarily invest in those areas. For instance, in European countries, an industrialist would also invest in housing, in education, in healthcare, in modernizing their industries so that the workers should not get hurt and injured. Whereas in India, whether it is mining industry, whether it is textile or other industries, the old redundant technology was continued for very long time because bringing new would be costly for them, and that would hurt the interest of the workers, as most of the Indian industrialists were private industries, were mostly interested in profit making. And that was the reason why our intellectuals, why our young civil servants, why our young political leaders were very much influenced by the socialist ideology. If you just scan post-independent literature, newspapers, and most of the debates in parliament and many states assembly, you would find socialist idea was very dominant. But the problem was that India is a big country and you cannot govern India with one ideology which would not fit. And that was one of the compulsion of our leaders. That is why the economic imperatives was a reason, though in their heart they wanted socialist ideology. So that's a very interesting debate, and you have to be careful that half of the statement, as I told, is written. The remaining half, which is not written, which is hidden, you have to extract through your knowledge of that debate, which is given, of course, in the books like Bipin Chandra, India Since Independence, and Ramchandra Goa, India Since Gandhi. But in the classroom, you can understand this better with certain questions, with certain facts, etc. So I hope you enjoyed this entire session, and it would enlighten you how to read the question which is written on the board, and also read which is not written but hidden. And that process starts when you start reading. At that time you have to think. When you start attending classes, at that time you have to listen some other things other than what is said. And of course you have to introspect, you have to reflect each time. Then you can write these questions very well. Thank you very much.